Good evening, everyone. I'm Allison Isberg. I am the president of the Council of Majors, and I just want to take a quick second. If you guys have cell phones with you, you can just turn them down or silent. I know most of you probably did, but sometimes you just kind of forget that they're in your pocket until they ring in the middle of class, and then your professor doesn't like you for a day. I just wanted to, before I introduce Dr. Lynch, I just wanted to recognize the members of the council who have worked ceaselessly with me to make this event possible. So if you guys could just stand when I say your names so that everybody can see you, that'd be great. Two members that couldn't be with us tonight, Donna Viola, who is our vice president, and Asif Majid, who is our new student liaison. We also have Alex Calvin, our secretary. Gift Jayakar, our treasurer. Heather Bollinger, in charge of events planning and public relations. We also have Joe Wazalowski, who's our visual graphics designer, walking around back there. Rob Bonfante, who is our president emeritus. He was a president a few years ago, he's coming back. And also our awesome advisors, Stephen McAlpine. Here. So yeah, they all worked really hard to make sure that this event could go off as planned. Our guest tonight is Dr. Kathleen Lynch. She's the executive director of the Folger Institute, and by participating in this event tonight, she becomes an honorary member of the INDS Council of Majors and receives a t-shirt from us as a token of your gratitude.
A major as unique as you are.
Oh, thank you.
Wear it with pride.
Thank you.
She has a PhD in English literature and has published articles in the Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Studies, as well as the Huntington Library Quarterly and others. And her book, Protestant Autobiography in the 17th Century Anglophone World, will be coming out soon from Oxford University Press. As head of the Folger Institute, Dr. Lynch has helped to organize many semester-long and weekend seminars, as well as symposiums and conferences, studying the Renaissance and the early modern period. The Folger Institute grew out of the Folger Shakespeare Library, which many of you are familiar with through the Folger editions of Shakespeare plays, which most of you have used in middle school or high school or in college. And the Folger Institute is in charge of basically creating events for master's, graduate, and professional level scholars who are studying the Renaissance or the early modern period. And many of these are interdisciplinary in nature, these events. And so the Folger Institute has made large strides in bringing interdisciplinarity into the humanities. And since that is what Dr. Lynch is going to talk to us about tonight, I will hand it over to her.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, everyone. Such a lovely, warm welcome, and I will wear the t-shirt with pride. I was cruising around your website, just looking up information about the Interdisciplinary Studies program, and noted that phrase and thought that was a fun way of announcing the program, that it's a major as unique as you are. And Allison certainly just mentioned the Folger editions. I should have thought, if you know the Folger, it may well be through an introduction of the Folger editions, reading a Shakespeare play or more than one Shakespeare plays in high school through a Folger edition. Is that the case? For how many people is that the case? As I said, I should have remembered. My own children went through school, sometimes reading Folger editions and sometimes reading other editions. And when one of my daughters was in high school and they were starting a Shakespeare play, I can't remember which one it was, the teacher handed out the books and somebody in class said, "Why aren't these Folger editions? We read the Folger editions last year and they're so much better." You know, the print is a little bit bigger on the Folger editions. There are a few pictures on the left-hand side of the page in the Folger editions. You know, they're a little more reader-friendly. And so my daughter came home and reported to me that there was a call for Folger editions in her class. And I went to my boss, who edited the Folger editions, and I said, we need Folger editions, and she sent me home with a box of editions, and they made their way to the high school class the next day, and I felt somehow we had achieved some small step for the humanities by passing out Folger editions in the high school classroom. But my real job here tonight is I have to introduce you or to reintroduce you to the Folger Library through the Folger Institute in our programs. And I was particularly interested by this invitation because of the strength of your program in interdisciplinary studies here, and the fact that I do think that interdisciplinarity is at the heart of everything we do at the Folger Institute. So really tonight what I wanted to do was give you some view of what interdisciplinarity looks like to us at the Folger, and then talk about think about some of the comparisons with the kinds of projects you take on as individuals or within your classes. Right now, it's fun to introduce you to the Institute through some of our anniversary materials. This year, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary. And most of you have picked up this little pamphlet that we put together here, and there's an associated website that I've called up here on the screen. Let me read a little bit of that blurb to you. Let's just pick out a few phrases there, because among other things, the anniversary was an opportunity for us to ask ourselves, okay, who are we? If we're going to introduce ourselves to people, what do we have to say about ourselves? What, how do we introduce ourselves? So here we go. The Folger Institute is a center for advanced studies in the early modern humanities. Its programs gather university faculty and graduate students for scholarly investigation of designated topics. Blah, blah, blah. Let me jump down to the next paragraph. Under the Institute's auspices, dedicated centers for Shakespeare studies and the history of British political thought set the agenda for advanced study in those fields. For more than 40 years, Institute programs have reinvigorated research and teaching of scholars in the humanities. And it's that word reinvigorated that I want to spend a little bit of time with first. How do we reinvigorate teaching and research in the humanities? I would say, and I am saying, that it's really by, first of all, asking fresh questions, also revisiting perennially important issues in the humanities, and above all, by organizing interdisciplinary conversations. And it's striking to me, actually, that we didn't put the word interdisciplinarity into this blurb, because, as I've already said, I do think it's at the heart of most of what we do. Our emblem, I would like to think, of our willingness to take a fresh look at things is this series of infographics, what I've been calling infographics, that we commissioned on the anniversary. And you see here the three of them lined up on the web page, and they're also in the brochure. On the web page, flanking these little visual presentations of information are the brochures that represent the very first year of programming in 1971, the spring of 1971, and then the current year of programming. Let me see if I can let's just look quickly at, take a little look at some of these. First, the word cloud. I mean, Shakespeare's obviously there, a pretty large size, and so is early modern, but you also see political thought. As I've already said, we've got two centers that specialize in Shakespeare and political thought. Renaissance is one of the biggest words in the word cloud, which is a little bit surprising to me because most scholars of that period no longer call it the Renaissance. Typically we talk about the early modern period now instead of the Renaissance. And we can talk about that a little bit too, what difference it makes. Is there anything about this word cloud that surprises you or that you find particularly notable? And I should say this has come up mostly from the titles of our programs. That was the database we were working with. Yeah?
I don't usually associate political thought with the Renaissance.
With the Renaissance or the Shakespeare Library, maybe?
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're going to get to that whole center in a few minutes. But yeah, I think that is one of the things that's a little bit striking. I would say, first of all, just the fact that there is such a range of programs and authors' names. We've got Erasmus and Petrarch in there, in addition to Shakespeare, Milton, other individual authors. I know social history is in there, political history. Anything else that? Yeah.
Paleography.
Paleography, which is learning how to read the handwriting of the period. Because the people wrote with a different system. And paleography is the ability to read that handwriting. Yeah. Paleography is a course that we teach every year, and we have taught from the very beginning, 40 years of that. Okay, so this, as I said, this is just one view of what we were doing. How do I close this? Okay, the next one, the Consortium Nautilus, is actually my favorite image just visually. And it's a really simple image. They did a bar graph, the people who put together this information for us. And it's a graph of the growth of the consortium of member universities. The Institute is supported now by more than 40 universities, mostly up and down the East Coast, but we are out to the Midwest as well. University of Toronto in Canada is a member. Texas A&M is a member, and we have 2 members in the United Kingdom. Belfast, Queen's University, Belfast, and St. Andrews. University of Maryland, Baltimore County is a member, has been a member for 30 of those 40 years. And again, what our graphic designers did for us was just take that information, plotting the growth from the very beginning when 2 local universities sat down with representatives of the Folger Library and decided to offer some graduate programs in common. And as I said, we've now grown to 45. So they took that graph and turned it around, and I think that's the genius of this image. Just the turning around gives it that sense of a nautilus, and gives it that sense of organic growth, and I just think that's a really fun image. The fact that these are images is also striking to me, at least. We are such a text-based place that it's rare that we bring visual information into play. And so it again, has just been delightful to be able to do that. Now the next image is fun, more fun. The compass rose, which again you have in paper, but on the web it turns and it reveals things, and it's very interactive. And I will just move it around a little bit. But basically what you have is a series of shapes and colors. It's the shapes that indicate program format. So as Allison said, we have conferences, we have lectures, we have symposia, we have colloquia, a whole different variety of formats. And we've indicated those with different shapes. And we've also pulled out disciplines: literature, history, drama. What else do we have? Art history, theater history, philosophy, religion. Down at the very bottom, it says interdisciplinary. I think it was actually so many of them are interdisciplinary. It was when we didn't know what else to call it, we called it interdisciplinary. But many of these programs are interdisciplinary. was key each one of these shapes and colors to a program. So of the hundreds of programs that we've offered over the 40 years are all represented on this compass rose somehow. And the idea really is to give you a sense of the variety of programs that we've offered. You can turn it around. This is on our website at www.folger.edu/institute. And if you'd like to go play with it, I hope you have some fun with it. But I just wanted to give you a sense, again, of our experimentation with the visual representation of information. We call this image the compass rose. A compass rose is a device on a map. Certainly maps in our period. I'm not sure that you're going to find a compass rose on very many contemporary maps. But it's the orientation device that usually has one angle with an arrow on the top, and that points north. It's your orientation to the north. The compass rose is, we think, kind of our logo at the Institute. And we came upon the compass rose as a logo because of its sense of direction and leadership and orientation and moving forward. We liked that as a kind of a guiding image for us. It also is a bit of an evolution from the Tudor rose. When the Institute was first founded, our logo was the Tudor rose. And I see somebody shaking her head, knowing that the Tudor rose was a symbol that in the time of King Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth, the Tudor monarchs, it was a symbol that united the colors of the red rose and the white rose. Those were the two warring parties that were united by the Tudor monarchs in Shakespeare's time. So that's a little bit of the background of our logo. I think I've gotten away from the PowerPoint by going through that. And if you can retrieve the PowerPoint presentation, that would be great. So what I really wanted to give you a sense of with these presentations of the anniversary materials was the wide world of programming at the Folger Institute. Thank you, Allison. And I don't know if you would be surprised or not, but it could be a little bit surprising that this wide world of humanities studies is sponsored by the Folger Shakespeare Library. Sorry, it's a little bit fuzzy, but I wanted to use that image to make the point. The point being that the Folger is in the shadow of the United States Capitol building, and that's no accident, it's by design. I know I shouldn't say it, but I often say that the Folger Institute was founded to overcome the built-in limitations of the name of our sponsoring institution. Shakespeare's our middle name. Shakespeareans know that they can come to the library and read about Shakespeare and work on Shakespeare. Students around the world associate the Folger with Shakespeare because of those editions. But the Folger Library actually supports so much more research in so many more fields. I truly think that was the reason that the Institute was established in 1970, to make sure that the scholars who could come to the Folger and make exciting discoveries in the materials there would come, and that people understood it was a wider world than just Shakespeare. Now, having said that, seeming to denigrate Shakespeare as just one isolated author among so many other, sort of arbitrarily chosen, I would say that it also says quite a lot about Shakespeare, that a library named for Shakespeare, in a library with such a concentration of materials about Shakespeare, would support and yield all kinds of research in early modern philosophy, religion, science, early modern science often, and political thinking. That Shakespeare as an author and the theater of his time was provided wide open access to the world of early modern England, and many faraway places and characters from those places and stories from those places made their ways onto Shakespearean stages. And in a way, the fact that people are doing research in a wide variety of fields at the Folger is kind of just repaying a debt to Shakespeare for opening up that world to his contemporaries. The library is the vision of Henry and Emily Folger. I like to think of the Folgers as children of the war, this particular war being the Civil War. They were, in my mind, New England abolitionists who saw their job, their destiny really, as rebuilding civilization after it had been more or less torn apart by the American Civil War. One small trivia point is that Henry Folger's money does not come from the coffee company, in case you wondered. It's actually oil money. Henry Folger went to Amherst College. His father lost his job when Henry was something like a sophomore or a junior. He ended up being supported through the rest of his time at Amherst College by his roommate's father. That was a Mr. Pratt, who had an oil company of his own. The Pratts early on associated with the Rockefellers and Standard Oil, and they were rolled into the Standard Oil Company. And Henry Folger ended his career as the president of Standard Oil of New York. So it is oil money. He is a robber. He was a robber baron, one of those guys at the beginning of the 20th century, who made a fortune in the States and went over to Europe and started buying the treasures of Europe. Now, the Folgers were a little bit different from most of the other robber barons of the time in that they had very specific interests in Shakespeare from a very early point. That interest in Shakespeare can be actually dated precisely to the evening when Henry Folger went to a college lecture. Now, I'm sorry that this slide is pretty blurry, but this is a copy of the ticket which we have at the Folger Library. It's cataloged, an item in our collection. It is the ticket that Henry Folger purchased to hear Ralph Waldo Emerson talk at Amherst College when he was an undergraduate. Emerson was really old at that time. I think one of his daughters was traveling with him and supporting him as bringing him up to the stage and bringing him down from the stage. But apparently whatever he said was so inspiring to Henry Folger that Folger went home, looked up a volume of his essays, and read in Emerson's essays one about Shakespeare as the leading light of Western civilization. And from that moment, his interest in Shakespeare grew, or can be dated. So he went from Amherst College to Pratt Oil Company and started working his way up the corporate ladder, and he and Emily started buying books. His first purchase is, I've listed here, I think it was a 4th folio, which is a way of saying the 4th edition of his collected works. I don't have a good view here, is it $104 or something, $107? $107.50 maybe. that was what his first purchase cost. Emily Folger went back to school to get a master's degree so that they would have a better understanding of the publication history of Shakespeare's editions, and so that she could better inform their buying. And for the next, I think it was 4 decades or more, they embarked on this book buying mission. Very closely focused on Shakespeare initially, and all of the printed materials from the early editions. The Folger is known for having multiple copies of the first edition. These editions are large scale, and so they're called folio after the size of the sheet of paper. Very large, like a coffee table size book. They understood, as many people did by the early 20th century, that each individual copy of an edition of an early printed book might vary slightly. And that is because, among other things, if in the course of printing a book somebody was correcting it, they would find an error, they would correct that error and go on, but nobody went back and started over. So, and then each copy might be an assemblage of almost arbitrary sheets from different points in the process, and each individual copy of a book from the period can be unique in some ways. Henry and Emily Folger's mission was to find the text, the true text of Shakespeare as Shakespeare wrote it. And this is why they collected multiple copies. We have in the library today, I wrote down there, approximately 80 copies. I say approximately because it's also kind of hard sometimes to understand what constitutes a copy. Some are partial. Do you have to have at least half the sheets to make it a copy? Do you have to have sheets that came originally from one copy? If things were put together from other partial copies, does that make a single copy or not? We traditionally have counted 79 copies of the first folio, which is really in some ways kind of ridiculous that the Folgers would have purchased 79 copies of that single edition. And many people at the time when they were collecting, scholars and other collectors alike, really resented the Folgers for, cornering the market on the first folios. So as I said, we have at least 79 copies. There seems to be this shift in thinking right now at the Folger. We've got a new librarian, and he's being persuaded to count some partial copies as full copies. And so you could also say maybe we have 82 or 83 copies, but it's one heck of a lot of copies of that one edition. Now, subsequently, no respectable scholar today believes in that agenda of reading through all of these individual copies, finding the mistakes, figuring out which mistakes or corrections were Shakespeare's, which came from the printing press, which came from whoever it was in the acting company who happened to have the manuscript, and sort through all of that in order to find the text as Shakespeare wrote it. Scholars aren't investigating that anymore. Scholars aren't pursuing that as a research goal. But there are other interesting things that you can do. Just the fact that we had so many copies of that one book in one place together for comparison enabled scholars to start thinking about the processes of printing. How does a play get from the theater to the manuscript to the press? And there's been a lot of work about the printing trade, a much greater understanding about how the book trade worked in London in the drama of Shakespeare, mostly thanks to the fact that Folger had all of these multiple copies of that single edition. So, and I'm this other slide is to indicate that the ways in which the collection also grew over time. There are manuscripts, there are artworks. We have, I I don't know if there's a number on here, how many hundreds of thousands of manuscripts and pieces of art we have, but it's a sizable collection of early modern materials. The image that's up on the screen here is of the earliest dramatic manuscript in England. It's a medieval manuscript. The Castle of Perseverance, and this is a drawing that is meant to represent the staging of this medieval play, and it's an incredibly valuable, rare item in our collection. So the Folgers were not only buying books, they were building a building, they were building a library. This is a view of our old reading room. It's matched now by a reading room the same size, called the new reading room, that was added on about 25 years ago. I think it's worth asking about the role of the library in intellectual work, because it's worth asking that for a number of reasons, but certainly including the fact that that role is changing, that many people don't need to go to a library anymore to find the materials that they're working with or on in their research projects. Because so many of our materials are rare artifacts from the period, the library still does have a vital role to play. The physical place has a vital role to play. The Folger is also actively digitizing items in its collection so that there are other ways of accessing them. You don't have to come to the library, but it's still worth coming to a research library like the Folger, because among other things, it's a laboratory. It's a unique working space in a scholar's career. It's set up for purpose-built for reading, for reflection, for discovery, for experimentation with some of the materials and ideas you're working with. Above all, it gives you this rare opportunity to do close work with primary sources. I'm really amused by this. This is actually a very small woodcut in a small book, and it shows a scholar at work. It's not a scholar from today, it's an early modern scholar. And I think one of the things you find when you go to a rare book library, or maybe if your work takes you to a museum or any kind of an archive holding different materials from a particular place and time, you not only work on the materials themselves, but in a way you meet the scholars from that previous time who also worked. You get to know their working habits. And one working habit is illustrated here in this tiny little woodcut. This comes from a volume that included a number of inventions. It was a collection of inventions. And the invention that's being illustrated here is a glass globe filled with water and suspended between the man who's sitting at his desk reading and a light and a candle. And so the idea is that you amplify the light and create a better working space. Whenever I look at this guy, I think he's a king because of that hat, but I also think he shouldn't be. Maybe it's some kind of a clerical hat, I don't know. But that is a really clever idea, and it does give you some sense of the working habits of scholars in, say, the 16th and 17th century. There are a lot of scholars now in the Folger community who are turning their attention to just these kinds of questions. Not so much reading the plays or reading the treatises, the religious or philosophical treatises in isolation, but thinking about the conditions of the intellectual work that was being done in the time period. Just a few weeks ago, we had a faculty weekend seminar directed by Anne Blair. This is the blurb that was really the call for applications for scholars working with these materials. Anne Blair has a brand new book out. It's called Too Much to Know, Managing Scholarly Information Before the Middle Age, or before the Modern Age. Ann Blair is a professor of history at Harvard. She's one of these very lucky few people who's won one of the things you call a Genius Grant, a MacArthur Fellowship. And her topic of investigation is scholarly work in the early modern period. How did people find, hold on to, organize the things that they were discovering in the course of their intellectual work? There is, I think, a really important reason why scholars are turning their attention to these kinds of questions now, and it has everything to do with the technological revolution that we're going through right now. Right as people are moving away from the printed book to work digitally, to work online, to work with different media of information exchange, it's a kind of a perfect opportunity to look back to the last technological revolution, when the printing press first came in, and think about what people were doing and how they were working with those materials. And again, there's no better place to ask those sorts of questions than a place that has the stuff, a place like the Folger. So here are just a couple of quick examples of the sorts of things that we have in our collection. Early modern note-taking. There were blank books that you could buy, and they might have, as the one on the left does, a little silver stylus with it that would tuck into the clasp somehow. And when you opened up that book, each of the pages, the paper pages, would be treated with gesso, a kind of almost painted over with a certain preparation that would allow you to take notes with that silver tip stylus, then go home, transfer them somewhere else, and erase the page, and then use it again and again and again that way. Until a few years ago, most people either didn't know that these notebooks existed, or they didn't pay any attention to them. But now there's kind of a craze of finding these and finding evidence of people using these sorts of notebooks. This is an example of somebody compiling an index in the back of one of their own books. Indexes are another important way of managing information. And this happens to be one in the back of a printed volume of John Donne's poetry, and an individual reader compiled his or her own index for that information. So if they wanted to find poems about God, for instance, as you see in the middle of that far column, or something about faith, I think is the word at the top of that far column, he or she, again, had his own system of compiling that information. There was apparently a lot of annotating of books going on in the early modern age, and in fact, there were instructions on the best way to annotate your book, and that's what you find here, printed in the margins, a reminder that it's a good idea to write things in the margins of your books, that this is a good way of keeping track of information. Many of the people who were buying old books at the beginning of the 20th century were looking for clean books, nice copies, lovely objects. The Folgers, interestingly, didn't care about the condition of the books that they were buying. They bought lots of what are called in the book trade dirty books, lots of things underlined, things annotated in the margins. And now, scholars come specifically to the Folger because we have the more interesting books with all of these annotations and underlines and evidences of people actually working with these materials. And then just finally, one more example about the way that people collected their own information, systematized their own information. You know, you may be building your own personal library, and this too is a handwritten list in a book of what seems to be a woman's collection of books from the period, and people were pretty excited about this when they found it because it was evidence of a woman reading, the type of materials that she would read, and it is kind of an interesting range, as noted at the bottom there. It starts with works by Calvin, but it includes literature. There's Spencer's Shepherd's Calendar is on that list, as is John Donne's poetry and many others. It's a list that goes over about 4 pages. So here too is a way into the world of some individual from a period 400 years ago. Okay, now so far, I think the interdisciplinarity has been kind of implicit in what I've been saying. And I wanted to turn to a few more explicit examples. And I also thought it would be interesting to try on for size your mission statement, because I went to your web pages and was reading how you describe, or when I say you, I know there are different groups here, but I'm thinking most specifically about the Interdisciplinary Studies program. There were several catchphrases that I thought were quite interesting ones, and I thought it was worth, as I said, trying on your phrases in our programs, maybe. So the phrases that I picked out of the mission statement were bridging disciplines, widening perspectives, discovering connections, and merging knowledge. I wanted to pull out just a few examples of these 4 objectives from Institute programs in the recent past. And the examples I'm using are on our web pages under a section called Faculty Resources, where we have some of what we call primary source books. They're web pages that have been put together by participants in different programs over time. To begin with bridging disciplines, BPT. BPT means British political thought to us, and specifically it's that center that I mentioned before, the Center for the History of British Political Thought, which somebody indicated was a little bit surprising to see sponsored by the Folger Shakespeare Library. This center got going about 20 years ago with NEH money, and they have very systematically, over these 20 years, and they're going strong, been doing what they call remapping the main patterns of discourse in a major political culture over 3 seminal centuries. Those 3 seminal centuries were 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Somebody asked what political thought was there at this time. The image is from the title page of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. Hobbes's Leviathan is famous. It's a landmark work in this history of political theory, because Hobbes said essentially that as an individual, in a member of a community, you voluntarily give up your rights to a single sovereign in order to get back other protections from the state. And that you do that out of self-interest involuntarily. Now, I think one of the major ways that this BPT Center has been doing what they're calling remapping is by making sure that when historians and political theorists and literary critics and whoever it is reading some of this material, when you read it, that you understand the historical period that it came from. So that you don't simply extract Thomas Hobbes's idea and set it loose in the world today, but that you understand the conditions of society that he was writing in. He was writing during the English Civil War. There was obviously a lot of controversy about how this society was going to move forward. Were they going to restore a monarch? Was the monarch, King Charles had been killed. It's the one time in English history that a king was killed. And this had just happened a few years before Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan. So again, it was a reminder by the historians in the group to the political theorists that you have to keep the history vibrant in your reading of these materials. And the other, I think, major contribution this BPT Center has made has been thinking seriously about what we mean by British or Britain. Because traditionally, British history has really been English history. And this center has made it their mission to think about Scotland, Ireland, Wales. A lot of scholars now talk about the three kingdoms of Britain. Wales, unfortunately, wasn't one of those three. Wales wasn't its own separate kingdom, but Scotland and Ireland sure were. And what kind of thinking was going on there, or what were the effects of the English tradition on the cultures in Ireland and Scotland? This is, I think, a really important contribution that this center has made. And I've listed on this slide just a few of the many publications that have come out of their programs in the past couple of decades. So that's my example of bridging disciplines. My example of widening perspectives comes from NEH Summer Institute we offered on Jamestown. This institute was offered in the summer of 2000, and it really was in preparation for the 400th anniversary of the founding of Jamestown that was coming. It has now passed. It was 2009. You may remember Queen Elizabeth came over and everything. It was a big deal. I live in Virginia. It was a very big deal to celebrate the founding of Jamestown. But the director of this program, who's Karen Kupperman, who's a professor of history at NYU, was determined to reorient our view of this one event in history. She wanted to do whatever she could to make sure that people didn't think that suddenly, out of nowhere, colonists sailed over from England and established a permanent colony in Virginia. She wanted to make sure that if people were talking about the founding of Jamestown, they were also talking about the colonies in Florida that both Spain and France had been involved in, the colony in Canada that France had established a couple of years prior to Jamestown, and also the fact that for 100 years or more before any of these permanent colonies were established, people from all of the Western European countries have been sailing over to Newfoundland on an annual basis, scooping up tons of cod and sailing back home. So there was, in some ways, nothing very new about the New World in 1609 when Jamestown was established. And so again, that's my example of widening perspectives, not only moving out from Europe to colonial America, but thinking about the English experience in America in a much wider context of other Western European nations. Okay. Then I've got two more rubrics and two more examples to go. Discovering connections makes me think of China. A year and a half ago, we had an exhibition at the Folger on Western views of China. It was curated by Timothy Billings, who's a professor of English at Middlebury College. And he had done a lot of work at the Folger with some materials having to do with English connections with China. So he organized an exhibition. Now, I think one of the really interesting things about the difference between something like an exhibition and an academic program is with an exhibition, you need stuff. You know, if you can have a great idea for an exhibition, but if you don't have the material to put together, it's not going to be an exhibition. For a conference, you don't necessarily need stuff. You need people. So they're really not, I mean, they can be complementary programs, but they work with different elements. And because we're the Folger Shakespeare Library, focused on Western European materials, really the only exhibition that Timothy could put on was of Western views of China. But because we were putting together a conference, we could add that other dimension back in. We could add China back in. So the exhibition could show us what Westerners thought of China. The conference could bring people to the library who could tell us what the Chinese view in the early modern period was of these encounters, what the effects were on Chinese culture and technologies. One of the sessions that we organized was on science and technology. And a little bit surprisingly to me, this session ended up focusing on Jesuits. We have, in this image from a book called China Illustrata, we have Matteo Ricci, who was the most successful early Jesuit missionary to China, standing with his contact, soon to become friend, a Chinese courtier. They ended up collaborating on many projects. They ended up translating, I think it was Euclid's Geometry into Chinese. They collaborated on that translation, and they became lifelong friends. So here's this wonderful example of what can happen when motivated people work across these divides of culture, language, and religion. But there was also a question that two of our speakers in the science and technology session raised for us, and that was, how do we explain the supposed backwardness of scientific thought in China in the 17th and 18th centuries? Now, the first talk was by Benjamin Ellman, who's a professor of East Asian Studies at Princeton. And he took up the question from a historiographical perspective. In his field, from his perspective, the common wisdom is that the Chinese have failed to develop in science in relation to Japanese developments. And I think he's talking about the 18th, 19th, up to the early 20th century, that China was understood to be backwards technologically. And he said this is a puzzle because arguably the Chinese were well ahead of everybody else in my period, the early modern period. That is, they had all kinds of mechanical techniques, like clocks, screws, levers, pulleys, that people around the world were applying to the mechanization of agriculture and industry. And additionally, they had these wonderful techniques for silk production and textile weaving and porcelain making, large-scale tea production. Again, techniques that people around the world were hoping to gain the secrets to. So his question, why were the Chinese so backwards technologically? Why did they fall behind? Having started ahead, why did they fall behind? Was it because they were closed-minded, and so they weren't interested in learning about the emerging early modern world and things like Newtonian physics that came along towards the end of the 17th century? Was it the Jesuits' fault? Was it because the Jesuits prioritized natural studies and mathematical astronomy during their early missions in order to suit the interests of the Chinese elite? And were the Jesuits interested in these topics because they were better conduits to their missionary work, which was their main objective? Or was it simply because the Jesuit order fell apart in the 18th century? They were forcibly disbanded. So did that simply break the circuit of communications in scientific worlds between East and West? I have no answers, but I thought they were fascinating questions and the kinds of questions that would not occur to me, especially the way he framed that whole talk as a comparison between China and Japan. So there's a third element in the equation. We're thinking about, we at the Folger Institute are thinking about what's the relationship between West and East, but he's also introducing a new element in there, that even in the East there are competing cultures with very different objectives and stages of development. Well, his talk was followed by another one by a historian from Caltech, Mordecai Feingold, and his talk was labeled why blame the Jesuits? and his point also was a historiographical point, and that is that the Jesuits have been scapegoated. The Jesuits have been scapegoated by the histories that have been written by the Protestant English over all of these centuries, and that we don't really understand what the Jesuits' objectives were. We don't really know that they were only interested in science as a cover for their missionary efforts. I mean, isn't it entirely possible, and Modi Feingold was encouraging us to believe that it was entirely possible that the Jesuits had their own valid scientific objectives. And so it was very unfair to blame the Jesuits, he says. And I think one of the fascinating things that both of these papers had in common was an understanding of how much any historical story we tell is affected by the perspectives of the people who are writing those stories. So one more example. Before we leave China, I'm sorry, this is my favorite part. Even if we don't get to the next example, I have to do this one. One more talk at this conference was about the crayfish ewer. Eva Strober, who's a curator at a museum in the Netherlands, gave us the case of the ewer in the shape of a crayfish. This is an example of the crayfish ewer, the kind of crayfish ewer that she was talking about. Ewer is a word for pitcher or jug, little water pitcher or jug. They're small objects. Now, she was telling us about a particular type of stoneware that was produced in southern China in the 16th century. It was not highly valued inside China. It was totally geared towards the export market from the very beginning. The objects were typically small, dishes, boxes, these little water jugs, sometimes animal-shaped, and there seemed to be an awful lot of them in this shape of a crayfish, often glazed, as this one is, in yellow, green, and brown. It's not a particularly beautiful object, and the Chinese, of course, were exporting all kinds of beautiful objects at this time, porcelain, silks, wonderful artifacts. Okay, so she asks, can we think of the crayfish as an agent of globalization? Was it produced for a special market? What were the reasons it was collected over time, and who were the collectors? What were the functions and the meaning of this small vessel in different times and contexts? Her story covered 400 years in very different cultures in the East and the West. She focused on examples of this unusual ewer found in different collections around the world today. In one collection is in the Netherlands, one she's familiar with. It came as part of a diplomatic gift of 14 pieces of Chinese porcelain given by the